The morning mist clung to Willow Creek like smoke from a dying campfire when Elwood McCall heard something that made his blood run cold. Not the usual splash of a beaver or the cry of a red-tailed hawk, but the unmistakable sound of human desperation echoing across the water. At 68 years old, Woody had learned to trust his instincts, and right now every fiber in his weathered body screamed that someone was drowning in those churning waters. What he pulled from that river would change everything he thought he knew about honor, family, and the thin line between two worlds that had been at war for over a century. Woody's arthritic hands trembled as he set down his morning coffee on the porch railing of his weathered ranch house. The September air in eastern Idaho carried the sharp bite of early autumn, and the cottonwoods along the creek had already begun their slow surrender to gold. He'd been watching the water rise for 3 days now, fed by unusually heavy rains in the mountains, and he knew these currents could kill a grown man in minutes. The sound came again, weaker this time, carried on the wind that swept down from the Sawtooth Mountains. Woody grabbed his walking stick and moved as fast as his war-damaged knee would allow, his 2 Australian shepherds, Rex and Blue, trotting anxiously beside him. The wet grass soaked through his worn leather boots as he made his way toward the creek bank, following a game trail he'd walked 1,000 times in 30 years of solitude. There, caught against a fallen log about 50 yards downstream, something dark bobbed in the rushing water. At first glance it looked like debris, maybe an old saddle blanket torn loose from someone's barn. But as Woody squinted through the morning haze, his heart nearly stopped. Long black hair fanned out like water grass, and a pale hand clutched desperately at the rotting wood. Without thinking, Woody plunged into the creek, the icy mountain water shocking his system and sending lightning bolts of pain through his old wounds. The current immediately tried to sweep his legs out from under him, but decades of ranch work had kept him strong despite his age. Hand over hand, he fought his way toward the log, his clothes growing heavier with each step. The girl couldn't have been more than 15 or 16, her brown skin pale with cold and shock. She wore traditional buckskin clothing that marked her as Native American, probably Shoshone from the reservation 40 miles east. A deep gash ran along her left temple, and her right arm hung at an unnatural angle. But she was breathing, and when her dark eyes fluttered open to meet his, Woody saw something that reminded him of his fallen brothers in Korea, a desperate will to survive that transcended all barriers of race or culture. Getting her out of the water nearly killed them both. The girl was dead weight, unconscious again by the time Woody managed to loop his arm around her chest and begin the treacherous journey back to shore. Twice the current almost claimed them, and by the time they collapsed together on the muddy bank, both were gasping and shivering uncontrollably. Woody carried her to his house in his arms, Rex and Blue circling anxiously as he kicked open the front door and laid her gently on his old leather couch. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and he could see she was in shock. The rational part of his mind knew he should drive straight to the hospital in town, but something about the elaborate beadwork on her dress and the silver ornament hanging from a leather cord around her neck told him this situation was more complicated than a simple rescue. As he wrapped her in wool blankets and built up the fire in his stone fireplace, Woody noticed details that made his gut tighten with unease. The girl's moccasins were barely worn, suggesting she hadn't been traveling far. Her clothes, while traditional, showed no signs of the wear you'd expect from someone living rough. And that silver ornament at her throat, an intricate Thunderbird design that seemed to catch and hold the firelight, looked old and valuable, the kind of thing that carried serious meaning in Native culture. While she slept, Woody cleaned and bandaged her wounds as best he could with his limited first aid supplies. The cut on her head would need stitches, and he was pretty sure her arm was dislocated at the shoulder. But she was alive, and for the first time in months, the old ranch house didn't feel quite so empty. As evening shadows stretched across the valley and the girl began to stir, Woody had no idea that 12 pairs of eyes were already watching his property from the ridge above, or that the ornament around her neck had been missing from the tribal council for 3 months. All he knew was that tomorrow would bring questions he wasn't prepared to answer, and consequences he couldn't yet imagine. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Sawtooth Valley, but Woody McCall had been awake for hours, sitting in his kitchen chair with a cup of bitter coffee growing cold in his hands. The girl, who had whispered her name as Ayana during a brief moment of consciousness around midnight, lay sleeping on his couch wrapped in every blanket he owned. Her fever had broken just before sunrise, and the ugly purple bruising around her dislocated shoulder had started to fade from black to yellow, a good sign that worried him almost as much as it relieved him. What worried him more was the absolute silence outside his windows. In 30 years of living alone on this land, Woody had never heard such complete quiet. No bird calls, no rustle of wind through the cottonwoods, even Rex and Blue lay motionless on the front porch with their ears flat against their heads. The kind of silence that comes before something terrible happens, the same suffocating stillness he'd felt in the Korean mountains right before the Chinese mortars started falling. At exactly 7 o'clock, Woody saw them. 12 figures emerged from the morning mist like ghosts made solid, walking in perfect formation down the dirt road that led to his ranch gate. They moved without hurry but with unmistakable purpose, their long dark coats and braided hair marking them as tribal elders even from a distance. No horses, no vehicles, just 12 old men who had somehow appeared on his land as if the earth itself had delivered them. Woody's hand instinctively went to the Winchester rifle mounted above his fireplace, then stopped. These weren't raiders or rustlers. This was something far more serious, and far more dangerous. This was judgment. The lead elder was a man Woody recognized from occasional trips to the trading post in Blackfoot, though they had never spoken. Joseph Crowfeather, the tribal chairman, whose weathered face could have been carved from the same granite as the mountains behind him. The other 11 flanked him in a semicircle, their expressions unreadable but their intentions clear. They had come for the girl. Woody stepped onto his front porch, acutely aware that his every movement was being watched and weighed. The morning air bit at his skin through his thin cotton shirt, but he refused to show any sign of discomfort. Rex and Blue whined softly and pressed against his legs, sensing the tension that hung in the air like smoke. For several long minutes, nobody moved. The elders stood silent at his gate, their dark eyes fixed on his house, while Woody remained motionless on his porch. It was a standoff as old as the West itself, two cultures measuring each other across an invisible line that had been drawn in blood and broken promises more than a century ago. Finally, Joseph Crowfeather spoke, his voice carrying easily across the 50 yards between them despite its quiet tone. "Elwood McCall. We have come for the girl." The words hit Woody like a physical blow, not because of their meaning but because of how the old man had said his name. With respect, but also with knowledge that went deeper than a simple introduction at a trading post. They knew who he was, had probably known for years. The realization sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the September cold. "She's hurt," Woody called back, his own voice rougher than he'd intended. "Needs medical attention. I was planning to drive her to the hospital this morning." "She needs to come home," another elder replied, a man with silver braids and scars across both cheeks. "There are things that must be settled." As if summoned by their voices, Ayanna appeared in the doorway behind Woody, moving slowly but under her own power. She had somehow managed to braid her long black hair and had wrapped one of his old blankets around her shoulders like a shawl. In the morning light, Woody could see that she was beautiful in the way of young women who haven't yet learned to doubt themselves, but there was also something ancient in her dark eyes, a gravity that seemed far older than her 15 years. When she saw the 12 elders at the gate, her face went pale and her hand flew instinctively to her throat, to the silver Thunderbird ornament that hung there on its leather cord. The gesture was small, almost unconscious, but Woody saw how every elder's gaze focused immediately on that spot. He also saw the recognition in their eyes, and something that might have been fear. "Grandfather," Ayanna called out in English, though her voice carried the musical cadence of her native language. "I am well. This man saved my life." The elder she had addressed, a man so old his skin looked like weathered leather, stepped forward. When he spoke, his words were directed at Woody but his eyes never left his granddaughter's face. "We know what he did. The question is why the Thunderbird came to him, and what it means for our people." Woody felt the ground shift beneath his feet, though he hadn't moved. The Thunderbird. He looked at the silver ornament hanging around Ayanna's neck with new understanding. This wasn't just jewelry. This was something sacred, something that belonged to the tribe, and somehow it had ended up around the neck of a girl he'd pulled from Willow Creek. "I don't know anything about any Thunderbird," Woody said carefully. "I just pulled a drowning girl out of the river. That's all." Joseph Crowfeather's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he didn't believe that was all there was to it. "The Thunderbird has been missing from our sacred lodge for 3 months, he said quietly. "Our medicine man dreamed that it would return to us carried by flowing water and protected by a man who had walked with our warriors in a distant land. He said this man would be marked by old wounds and would live alone with the spirits of faithful dogs." Woody's blood turned to ice water in his veins. The Korean War. His Shoshone brothers in arms. The shrapnel still buried in his left knee. Rex and Blue, whose bloodlines went back to the first Australian shepherds his grandfather had brought to this valley 50 years ago. "That's impossible," he whispered, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't. Ayanna stepped closer to him, and for the first time since pulling her from the creek, Woody saw her smile. "Nothing is impossible, Grandfather Woody," she said softly. "Sometimes the spirits just take longer to deliver their messages than we expect." As the 12 elders began walking through his gate without invitation, Woody realized that everything he thought he understood about his quiet life in the mountains was about to change forever. The 12 elders arranged themselves in a perfect circle around Woody's kitchen table without being invited, their weathered faces solemn and the pale morning light filtering through his windows. Ayanna sat beside her grandfather, the ancient man whose eyes held depths that seemed to reach back through generations of memory and pain. Woody remained standing, his back against the kitchen counter, feeling like a stranger in his own home yet somehow understanding that this was exactly how it was supposed to be. Joseph Crowfeather reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch, carefully untying the sinew cord that held it closed. From inside, he pulled out a faded black and white photograph, its edges worn soft from decades of handling. He placed it on the table where everyone could see it. "Hill 255. November 1951, Joseph said quietly. 3rd Infantry Division. Do you recognize any of these faces, Elwood McCall?" Woody's heart stopped. The photograph showed 8 soldiers huddled around a makeshift fire in what looked like the frozen hell of a Korean winter. 6 white faces, 2 Native American. And there in the center, 20 years younger but unmistakably himself, sat a kid from Idaho who thought he understood what war meant. "Billy Crowfeather," Woody whispered, his voice breaking as he pointed to one of the native faces. "And Thomas Running Bear. They saved my life when the Chinese overran our position. Billy carried me 3 miles through the snow with shrapnel in my knee. Thomas died covering our retreat. Billy Crowfeather was my nephew," the old man said, his eyes never leaving Woody's face. "Thomas Running Bear was Ayanna's great-uncle. They both wrote letters home about a white soldier who shared his rations and treated them like brothers instead of curiosities. They said if they didn't make it home, we should remember his name." The silence that followed was heavy with ghosts and grief. Woody could feel the weight of 30 years pressing down on his shoulders, all the nights he'd woken up screaming their names, all the times he'd wondered why he'd survived when better men had died. "The Thunderbird belonged to Thomas," another elder spoke, his voice like wind through dry grass. "It was supposed to protect him, but sometimes protection takes forms we don't expect. Perhaps it was protecting the man who would one day save his great-niece." Ayanna's hand went to the silver ornament at her throat, and for the first time, Woody saw tears in her dark eyes. "I stole it," she said quietly, her words falling into the kitchen like stones into still water. 3 months ago, when the council decided I had to marry Walter Painted Horse. He's 42 years old and already has 2 wives, but his family has money and our family needs the bride price to keep our land. I took the Thunderbird from the sacred lodge because I thought it would give me the courage to run away forever. Instead, it brought you home," her grandfather said gently. "Just not the way you expected." Before anyone could respond, the sound of vehicles approaching broke the morning quiet. Through the kitchen window, Woody could see 3 trucks kicking up dust clouds as they raced down his driveway. The lead vehicle was a white Bronco with government plates, followed by 2 pickup trucks filled with men wearing the kind of grim expressions that meant serious trouble. "Bureau of Indian Affairs," Joseph Crowfeather said without looking toward the window. Someone in town must have seen us walking to your ranch and made a call. They think we're here to cause problems." Agent Mitchell Thornton stepped out of the Bronco like a man who owned whatever ground his feet touched. Woody had dealt with him before, a career bureaucrat who viewed the reservation system as his personal kingdom and treated both whites and natives with equal condescension. Behind him came Sheriff Eddie Walsh and four men Woody didn't recognize but who had the look of federal marshals about them. Well, Thornton called out as he approached the house, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a man used to getting his way through intimidation. "Looks like we've got ourselves a situation here. Mr. McCall, I'm going to need you to step outside so we can have a little chat about kidnapping charges and unlawful detention of a minor." Woody felt the blood drain from his face. Through the kitchen window, he could see more vehicles approaching from the direction of town, including what looked like an ambulance and a news van from the local television station. Word was spreading fast, and in a few hours this story would be all over the state. Old white rancher takes Indian girl. In 1978, that narrative could destroy lives and reignite racial tensions that had been simmering just below the surface for decades. "Nobody's been kidnapped," Woody called back, but his voice sounded weak even to his own ears. "That's not how it looks from where I'm standing," Thornton replied, his hand resting casually on the butt of his service weapon. "I've got a runaway tribal member in the custody of a white man who has no legal authority to detain her. I've got 12 tribal elders who crossed reservation boundaries without proper documentation. And I've got a mess that's about to turn into a media circus if we don't handle it right now." Ayanna stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor, the silver Thunderbird catching the light as it swung on its leather cord. "I wasn't kidnapped," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the open window. "I was rescued." "That's not your decision to make, sweetheart," Thornton replied. "You're a minor under federal jurisdiction. Your grandfather can explain the law to you on the ride back to the reservation." But as Agent Thornton reached for his handcuffs, something happened that nobody expected. The 12 elders rose as one and walked out of Woody's kitchen, moving with the same silent coordination they'd shown when they'd appeared at his gate. They arranged themselves in a protective semicircle around the house, their faces stern and unyielding. "This is our sacred business," Joseph Crowfeather said quietly, but his words carried across the yard with the authority of mountains. "The Thunderbird has chosen its path, and white man's law has no power over the will of the spirits." Agent Thornton's face flushed red, and Woody knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether this ended in understanding or bloodshed. The standoff lasted exactly 17 minutes, though to Woody it felt like 17 hours. Agent Thornton stood with his hand on his weapon, his face growing redder by the minute as news crews set up their cameras and curious townspeople gathered along the road to watch the confrontation unfold. The 12 tribal elders remained motionless in their protective semicircle, their weathered faces showing no emotion but their eyes burning with generations of righteous anger. Then Ayanna did something that changed everything. She walked out of Woody's house carrying the silver Thunderbird in her open palm, the morning sun making the ancient metalwork gleam like captured lightning. Without hesitation, she moved to stand between Agent Thornton and her grandfather, a 15-year-old girl placing herself in the path of federal authority with nothing but courage and conviction. "You want to arrest someone for kidnapping," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard to where the news cameras were rolling. "Then arrest Walter Painted Horse for trying to buy me like cattle. Arrest the tribal council for selling me to pay debts. Arrest every man who thinks a woman's worth is measured in horses and money instead of dreams and dignity." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as Ayanna lifted the Thunderbird toward the sky, its silver surface catching and scattering light like stars. "This belonged to my great-uncle Thomas Running Bear, who died protecting his brothers in a war that wasn't even ours to fight. It was stolen from the Sacred Lodge not by thieves, but by greed and tradition that cares more about preserving the past than protecting the future. The spirits didn't bring me to this man's river to punish me for running away. They brought me here to show our people that honor isn't about following old rules that no longer serve us. It's about choosing to do what's right even when it's difficult." Joseph Crowfeather stepped forward, his ancient eyes bright with something that might have been pride or wonder or both. "And what do you choose, granddaughter?" Ayanna turned to look at Woody, and in that moment he saw not a frightened runaway girl but a young woman who had found her voice in the space between two worlds. "I choose to finish school," she said firmly. "I choose to go to college like the white girls in town, but I also choose to learn the old stories from grandmother so they won't be lost forever. I choose to honor Thomas Running Bear's memory not by hiding behind traditions that would have seen me sold like property, but by building bridges between his world and this one." She walked to Woody and placed the Thunderbird in his weathered hands. "And I choose to trust this man who risked his life to save mine, who shared his home with a stranger, and who carries the spirits of our fallen warriors in his heart. If the council wants to arrest someone, they should arrest themselves for forgetting that protecting our people means protecting our children's right to choose their own paths." Agent Thornton lowered his hand from his weapon, the fight gone out of him as suddenly as it had appeared. Around the yard, Woody could see the faces of the townspeople who had gathered to watch what they'd expected to be a confrontation between savage Indians and civilized authority. Instead, they had witnessed something far more dangerous to their comfortable prejudices, a young native woman speaking with more wisdom and courage than most adults ever managed to summon. "Miss," Thornton said quietly, his bureaucratic bluster replaced by something approaching respect. "You're still a minor under federal jurisdiction. I can't just ignore the law because you make a pretty speech." It was Joseph Crowfeather who answered, his voice carrying the weight of mountains and the patience of centuries. "The law," he said slowly, "is what we make it. And today, we choose to make it something better than what we inherited." He turned to face the news cameras, his weathered face stern but his eyes bright with purpose. "Let it be known that the Shoshone-Bannock Tribal Council recognizes Elwood McCall as an honored friend of our people. Let it be known that any man who served beside our warriors in distant lands and who risks his life to save our children is welcome in our lodges and at our fires. And let it be known that the old ways of arranging marriages without consent are ended from this day forward, replaced by laws that honor the choices of our young women as much as the wisdom of our elders." The crowd erupted in murmurs and scattered applause. Agent Thornton looked around at the cameras, the tribal elders, and the growing crowd of witnesses, and Woody could see him calculating the political cost of trying to arrest a war veteran and a teenage girl in front of rolling news cameras. After a long moment, he holstered his weapon and stepped back. "This isn't over," he said, but his heart wasn't in the threat. "Yes," Joseph Crowfeather replied calmly. "It is." As the federal agents climbed back into their vehicles and drove away, Woody found himself surrounded by 12 tribal elders who no longer looked like strangers. They embraced him one by one, their weathered hands strong and warm on his shoulders, their eyes bright with acceptance he had never dared to hope for. "You gave us back our Thunderbird," the old medicine man said quietly. "But more than that, you gave us back our granddaughter's voice. There is no gift more precious." Later that evening, after the news crews had packed up their cameras and the townspeople had returned to their comfortable assumptions, Woody sat on his front porch with Ayanna beside him. Rex and Blue lay contentedly at their feet, and the silver Thunderbird hung once again around the girl's neck where it belonged. "So what happens now?" Woody asked, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. "Now you teach me how to fix that broken fence post by the creek," Ayanna said with a smile. "And I teach you how to make fry bread that doesn't taste like cardboard. And maybe, if we're very lucky, we show the world that families aren't always made by blood, but sometimes by choice and courage and the willingness to love someone different from yourself." Woody looked out across his land, the same valley where he had lived alone with his ghosts for 30 years, and for the first time since Korea, he felt like he was truly home. Tomorrow there would be challenges, paperwork, visits from social workers and tribal officials. But tonight there was just an old man and a young woman sitting together in the gathering darkness, two souls who had found each other across the bridge of an ancient Thunderbird and discovered that sometimes the spirits work in ways more mysterious and beautiful than human understanding could ever grasp. The last light of day painted the Sawtooth Mountains gold and purple, and in that light, anything seemed possible. What did you think of this incredible story of courage, cultural bridge building, and unexpected family? If this touched your heart like it touched mine, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments which moment moved you most. Was it Ayanna's brave speech to the federal agents? Woody's recognition in that old war photograph? Or perhaps the beautiful ending where two lost souls found each other across cultural boundaries? Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell for more amazing true stories that will restore your faith in humanity. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that love, courage, and understanding can overcome even the deepest divides. What stories from your own family's past would you like to see explored? Drop your suggestions in the comments below, and remember, every subscription helps us bring you more incredible stories that prove the human spirit is stronger than any prejudice or fear. Until next time, keep believing in the power of unexpected connections and never underestimate the courage it takes to build bridges between different worlds.